The dirt beneath her knees was hot enough to brand skin, but Sarah Hayes barely noticed as she pressed her palms into the cracked earth and whispered a prayer that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with sheer desperation. It was June of 1883, and Wickenburg, Arizona, had not seen rain in 4 months. Yet here she knelt in what used to be her father's cattle ranch, now transformed into rows of carefully marked plots where she intended to grow vegetables, flowers, and hope in equal measure. The sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of red dust across her pale skin. At 23 years old, she had already buried both parents within the span of a year, the consumption taking her mother last winter and a rattlesnake bite claiming her father just 3 months past. The ranch had been failing even before his death, the cattle dying one by one as water sources dried up and the land turned increasingly hostile. Everyone in town told her to sell what remained and move back east where a proper young woman belonged, but Sarah had other plans. She had spent the last 2 months reading every agricultural journal she could get her hands on, writing letters to botanists and farmers across the country, studying indigenous plants and their root systems. If anything could grow in this God-forsaken desert, she would find it. She would make it happen. The alternative was losing the only home she had ever known, the land her father had worked himself to death trying to preserve. "You have lost your mind completely," came a deep voice from behind her. Sarah did not bother turning around. She recognized the drawl of Owen Lancaster, the cowboy who had worked for her father for the past 5 years before the ranch could no longer afford to pay him. He had left 3 weeks ago, heading north to find work with the cattle operations near Prescott, and she had assumed he was long gone by now. "If you have come back to tell me what I already know, you have wasted a trip," Sarah said, using a small hand trowel to dig into the unforgiving soil. "I've heard every opinion this town has to offer about my sanity." Owen dismounted from his horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Copper, and walked closer. His shadow fell across Sarah's work, providing a momentary relief from the sun. "I came back because Bill Thompson at the feed store mentioned you were out here trying to plant a garden, in the desert, in June, during a drought. Your observational skills remain as sharp as ever." Sarah finally looked up at him, shading her eyes with one hand. Owen Lancaster was 30 years old, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of whiskey. He wore the same work clothes he always did, faded denim and a shirt that had once been blue but had long since surrendered to dust and time. A worn hat sat low on his head and his dark brown hair curled slightly at his collar. "Sarah, this is not going to work." His voice was gentler now, almost pleading. "You cannot grow crops in this soil without water and the well is nearly dry. Then I will find water." She returned to her digging with renewed determination. "Or I will use less water, or I will grow plants that do not need much water. I will figure it out." Owen crouched down beside her, his knees cracking slightly with the movement. "Your father was a good man, and he tried everything he could think of to keep this place running. Sometimes you have to accept that the land just will not cooperate. My father tried to raise cattle." Sarah's voice was firm but not unkind. "I am not raising cattle. I am going to grow food, flowers, medicinal herbs. I am going to turn this dead earth into something living again. With what money? Seeds cost money, water costs money, time costs money, and you are burning through all three." Sarah sat back on her heels and met his gaze directly. "I sold my mother's jewelry. I have enough for seeds and supplies for the first season. If I can produce even a small crop, I can sell it and buy more for the next planting. The army fort 20 miles north needs fresh vegetables. So does the mining camp. Everyone around here is eating dried beans and salt pork. If I can give them fresh tomatoes, lettuce, squash, they will pay." Owen studied her face for a long moment, taking in the sunburn across her nose, the determined set of her jaw, the calluses already forming on her delicate hands. Sarah Hayes had been just a girl when he first came to work for her father, barely 18 and fresh from a year at a finishing school in San Francisco. Her mother had insisted on it, though her father had grumbled about the expense. She had returned with refined manners and a head full of poetry, seeming utterly unsuited for ranch life. But Owen had watched her transform over the past 5 years, learning to ride, to shoot, to work alongside the ranch hands without complaint. The finishing school polish had worn away, revealing someone far stronger underneath. "What do you need?" he asked finally. Sarah blinked, clearly surprised. "I beg your pardon. What do you need to make this work? You cannot do it alone. Even if you had water and seeds and perfect soil, one person cannot work land this size. I thought you had a job in Prescott." Owen removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "I did. I quit. The foreman was a bastard who liked to use his fists on anyone who talked back, and I have never been good at keeping my mouth shut. So you came back here, to a failing ranch with no cattle and a delusional woman trying to grow roses in hell." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "When you put it that way, it does sound questionable. But yes, I came back here." Sarah felt something warm unfold in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the relentless sun. "I cannot pay you properly, maybe a few dollars a month in meals once I actually have food to cook." "I will take whatever you can spare. I can sleep in the bunkhouse and Copper does not eat much." He stood and offered her his hand. "But if we are going to do this, we need to start with water. The well is not going to be enough. We need to find another source or figure out how to make every drop count." Sarah took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Standing this close, she could smell horse and leather and sweat, a combination that should have been unpleasant but somehow was not. "I have been thinking about that. The Hassayampa River runs underground through this area. If we could dig deep enough, tap into it somehow. That would take equipment we do not have and expertise neither of us possesses. Then we start smaller. I read about a technique called dry farming, where you plant deep and mulch heavily to retain whatever moisture exists in the soil. And there are desert plants, native ones, that need almost no water once established. If I can propagate those, sell them to people who want gardens that will actually survive here." Owen replaced his hat and nodded slowly. "It is still a long shot. Everything worth doing is a long shot." Sarah looked out across the barren land, seeing not what it was but what it could become. "My father spent his whole life fighting against this place, trying to make it into something it was not. I want to work with it, find what will thrive here naturally. You really have thought this through." "I have had nothing but time to think." She walked toward the small adobe house that sat at the edge of the property, and Owen fell into step beside her. "I know everyone expects me to fail. I know the odds are terrible, but I would rather die trying than give up without a fight." The house was small but well built, thick walls that kept the interior cooler than the outside furnace. Sarah had been living here alone since her father's death, which scandalized the town's more proper citizens but which could not be helped. She had no other family, no relatives willing to take her in. It was this or the charity of the church, and Sarah had too much pride for charity. She poured 2 glasses of water from the clay jug she kept in the coolest corner and handed one to Owen. "I went into town yesterday and ordered seeds. They should arrive within the week. I bought things I know can handle heat, peppers, tomatoes, certain varieties of squash. Also some herbs like sage and rosemary. And I got seeds for flowers that grow in Mediterranean climates since the conditions are similar. Owen drank deeply, grateful for the water despite it being lukewarm. What about irrigation? I have been sketching out a system. If we can build channels from the well to the different garden plots, we can control exactly where the water goes and not waste any. And I want to try something called a drip system, where you use perforated vessels buried near the plant roots. The water seeps out slowly, directly where it is needed. That sounds complicated. It is, but it works, at least according to the agricultural journals. She set down her glass and pulled a rolled paper from a shelf, spreading it across the scarred wooden table. The paper was covered with detailed sketches and notes in her careful handwriting. I have divided the land into sections. This area here will be for vegetables that I can sell. This section will be experimental, trying different plants to see what survives. And this part closest to the house, that is where I want to create a real garden, not for profit, just for beauty. Owen studied the plans, impressed despite himself. You have put a lot of work into this. It is all I have. The words came out more vulnerable than she intended, and Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. This land is all I have left of my parents, of everything they built. I cannot let it die. He looked up from the papers and met her eyes. In the dimmer light of the house, they were startlingly blue, and Owen found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before. The way her blonde hair, darkened with dust and sweat, escaped its pins in wispy curls around her face. The spattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks. The fullness of her lower lip, currently caught between her teeth as she waited for his response. "Then we will not let it die," he said, and meant it. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Owen repaired the well mechanism, which had been failing, and constructed a series of wooden channels to direct water flow to different parts of the property. Sarah prepared the soil, mixing in what little compost she could gather and sand to improve drainage for certain plants. They worked from dawn until the heat became unbearable in early afternoon, then retreated to shade until evening when they could work again. The seeds arrived on schedule, delivered by the stagecoach that passed through Wickenburg twice a week. Sarah opened the packages with the excitement of a child at Christmas, showing Owen each variety and explaining her plans for it. He listened patiently, learning to tell the difference between pepper seeds and tomato seeds, understanding which plants needed full sun and which preferred partial shade. "You are actually interested in this," Sarah observed one evening as they sat on the porch of the house, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of orange and pink. Owen shrugged. "It is more interesting than I expected. I always thought plants just grew on their own, that you put a seed in dirt and waited. I did not know there was so much science to it. Everything is science if you look closely enough." She was mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the fading light. "My mother used to say that God was in the details, that paying attention to small things was a form of prayer." Was she religious? Not particularly, at least not in the way the church ladies in town are.